There we are. Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us at the National Library of Scotland talk on Wanderers, A History of Women Walking. I'm Paula Williams and I'm Curator of Maps, Mountaineering and Polar Collections at the National Library of Scotland. And tonight you're joining us for a conversation between me and Dr. Kerry Andrews. Now, my role at the National Library of Scotland is, I think, one of the best that the library has. I have all the best bits of collection to look after. And most recently, I've been working on our Petticoats and Pinnacles, Scotland's Pioneering Mountain Women, which will be an exhibition just as soon as we can open it to the public. We've been talking about this exhibition now for what seems like years, and Kerry's book that we're going to discuss this evening fits so beautifully with the theme that this made a perfect event for us. I've been working on lectures and research articles, and we have some activities and further information available through our learning zone on the website on Aiming High. So feel free to go and have a look at that after the event. This evening's event will largely be, I'll introduce Kerry, Kerry will introduce the book, then we're going to have a chat about the book and some of the ideas around the women. And we would be very grateful if you would ask some questions as we go through. You'll find at the bottom of your screen that there's a Q&A box. And as questions pop into your mind, please put them in there. We'll have a moderated session of questions at the end. So Kerry Andrews is Reader in Women's Literature and Textual Editing at Edgehill University. Kerry is one of the leaders of the Women in the Hills, an Arts and Humanities Research Council funded project aimed at exploring the factors enabling and inhibiting women's access to upland landscapes. The project brings together people from all areas of walking and mountaineering, land access and management to drive change in women's access and experience. And it was through this project that I first met Kerry. Because of our overlapping interest between women walking and women in the mountains, we got together for a coffee chat round about this time last year, just before first lockdown. And Kerry told me about her forthcoming book. I got very excited and thought this would be a perfect event to sit alongside the exhibition. The book came out, the exhibition didn't, but will happen in the future. But it means that this can be a little trailer towards that. And while there are some overlaps in the book, some of the same people we discuss, Kerry has brought a whole different field. And I think it's really valuable that we can have this chat. And I'm really excited about having it. So the book is Wanderers, A History of Women Walking. Ta-da! Trying desperately to get that in screen. Which was published by Reaction in September 2020. It traces the footsteps of 10 women walker writers. Lockdown and COVID-19 restrictions have given many of us an opportunity to walk locally or exercise, or to simply escape these four walls and all the people in them, including ourselves. And I think that maybe it's given Kerry's book a new resonance that we wouldn't have had if we hadn't had lockdown. In the foreword of the book, Kathleen Jamie says, "Thanks to this book, we know that even in solitude, we never walk alone. A fine female tradition is at our backs, encouraging us along." And I think that the walking is such an important part of what we do as humans that I'm really excited to see Kerry's examination of it. And Kerry's now going to tell us a bit more about the book.
Thanks so much, Paula. Good evening, everybody. And just a quick thank you to the NLS for hosting this event and inviting me. It's a real privilege to be here, virtually speaking to you. So thank you ever so much for that. It's a real treat to talk about Wanderers, and I thought it would be helpful for those who are interested in women's walking but who haven't necessarily read the book to know a little bit about what's in the book and why we're talking about that tonight in the context of Paula's exhibition, which I'm really excited to see when it finally comes out. So the book covers 10 women who have walked from the early 18th century all the way through to the present day. They're women of different backgrounds, from different places in society, and who found walking important or useful for very different reasons. There's lots and lots of different kinds of walking here. So the book starts with a woman called Elizabeth Carter, who was an intellectual from the early 18th century, who liked to go wandering alone in Kent, but who liked to write about these adventures with her friends and to take her friends' books with her as part of a way of experiencing companionship. And then my book sort of traces the history of walking from Carter all the way through via Dorothy Wordsworth, Harriet Martineau, Virginia Woolf, Aeneas Nin, through to Nan Shepherd, and then finally to Linda Cracknell, who's a writer-walker who's still active in Scotland, who's written really interestingly about a female tradition of women's walking, which is an idea that sort of emerged as the book developed, and it really realised I was participating in it until the book had finished. But this idea that women have always been in the landscape, have always walked, have always found it useful, despite what else we've inherited about what it was possible for women to do, or what sorts of experiences they had. Women have always been there walking and finding it important for their creativity, for their senses of self, for all sorts of reasons. So the book covers, there's bits of Scotland, lots of bits of Scotland, in fact, especially the Highlands, great love of mine, but there's also Kent, there's bits of America, France, various places, city walking, rural walking, mountain walking, lots of different kinds of walking experience covered over the course of those 10 women. So hopefully it gives a broad overview of this history, which I don't think we've sort of really understood is there, and which myself as a woman walker, I certainly didn't know was there, and which I hope is something that enriches people's experiences walking, to know that there are these women at our backs.
Kerry, sorry, and Paula, sorry to interrupt. We've just got a couple of people coming in on the Q&A just now. Kerry, are you able to turn your volume up on your...
Yes, I can. Is that any better?
It's fine with me, so if you can just turn it up.
Yeah, I'm conscious of to anybody who struggled to hear me. It'll be much more interesting when Paula starts asking questions.
Thank you very much, and apologies to everybody. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll start asking questions in that case. Thanks for that overview, Kerry. How did you come to your 10 women?
A combination of things, partly finding people sort of very briefly mentioning women walkers in books that I was reading, usually frustratingly brief references. So lots of walking literature that I was reading, because I thought I was writing a different book for a while. You know, the 270-page book about walking, and there were 4 pages on women, which I was appalled by, but it did mention 2. So that was Dorothy Wordsworth and Virginia Woolf. So and I knew Dorothy Wordsworth through my work as a romanticist. So some women I was aware of. Others were happenstance references. So I was reading a wonderful book by a guy called Maurice Marples called Shanks's Pony, which referenced Ellen Wheaton, who's a governess from Lancashire who was walking in the 1820s, and I'd not heard of her. So that was a really rich seam of material to go off and explore. Others were through conversation. A friend of mine, Jo Taylor, who I work with on the Women in the Hills project, mentioned Harriet Martineau as a walker, and then again another rich seam opened up. States, working on a different project in California, and ended up having wine nibbles with a group of really wonderful women who just sort of went, well, you do know Elizabeth Carter walked, don't you? Which I was very surprised by. So a nice mixture of happenstance, you know, genuine actual research, and blind luck were some of the circumstances that helped me towards these women. You're on mute, Paula.
Sorry. It was bound to happen at some point. From my own research, I know that inevitably you find more people, and it kind of grows like Topsy. And I was wondering how you managed to narrow it down to just these women, because obviously there's loads of them out there, really.
Yeah, so it was a combination of, as I said, thought I was writing a different book. This book emerged gradually. But what I wanted to do when I realised that I was writing a book about women walkers was challenge the idea that we seem to have received that only men found walking important for their creativity, which is an idea we've inherited from the Romantic era, that walking equals poetry, poetry equals status, and that only men have access to that. And that's what a lot of these walking books were claiming, referencing Henry Thoreau and Wordsworth and Coleridge and all these sort of male figures, and how they paced their poetry into being and how wonderful they were. So what I thought was really important was to be able to sort of interrupt that narrative by finding women who found walking really important for themselves as writers, so that they consciously reflected on what walking meant for them. It wasn't just incidental, it was something that they were mindful of as they were doing it. And that actually had quite a tightening effect on the project, because there's, as you say, there's loads and loads and loads of women walking, but not so many of them writing about it in those ways. And those that were writing about it didn't necessarily publish. So finding that material was occasionally a little challenging. So that really helped narrow down the focus. At the same time, there were lots and lots of amazing women I'd love to have included. My favourite one that never made it in was Jane Austen, because I adore Elizabeth Bennet, the most amazing walking heroine of any novel anywhere, and I will fight people about that. She's just terrific. But Austen herself is so mundane about her writing, about her walking. Went for a walk is what her letters said. And there was no way I could make an interesting story about that in this book. So there's lots and lots of other people I would have liked to have included, but they weren't reflecting on what walking meant to them as writers. So there are lots and lots of other books about women's walking that can and should be written, because there's so, as you know perfectly well, there's a huge amount of material out there that deserves to be better known.
There is. I think that challenge of finding the right material that allows you to make that selection is in itself an interesting thing. And from my own one with Petticoats and Pinnacles, in which case we're looking at 8 women within the exhibition space. Again, I've got 5 times that number that I could have included, many of whom have fantastic stories, but they didn't have the material to support them within that exhibition context. They might have within a book context or within an article, but not to visually display. One of my favourites in that context was Maria Ogilvie Gordon, who is a absolutely fascinating woman from Aberdeen, and we think that she was actively rock climbing in the Dolomites in the 1880s, which is fairly early. Her PhD was in geology, and geology was one of the acceptable things for women to do at that time, along with botany. And she took herself off there, managed to find a supervisor. She couldn't find one in the UK. Managed to find one in Germany who was doing some work already in the Dolomites. And then she spent these summers rappelling, I guess, up and down rock faces, working out the stratigraphy of this particular part of the Dolomites. She then went on to campaign for women's suffrage, women's education, all sorts of cool things. But we just don't have anything that means that I could include her, which was such a shame. But yeah, I get that thing about how you need them to fit within the construct, or else it just becomes too rambly and too difficult, and it loses that focus, which I think your book beautifully has. I really enjoyed reading it. I think, as I mentioned in the intro, I think lockdown has maybe changed how a lot of us view walking, and we've felt a need to walk and to escape. And I was wondering if maybe some of your women were walking to get away from social constructs, from social the requirements that were put upon them at home, whether that was family or extended family if they didn't have a home of their own. And I was just wondering if you could maybe chat a wee bit about that.
Yeah, sure. And I think that's probably true for some of them. Certainly someone like Sarah Stoddart Hazlitt, who ends up in Edinburgh in dreadful circumstances. You've been dragged up from London so that she can be cheaply divorced by her, skinflint husband who wants to shack up with a barmaid. It's just so tawdry, the whole setup. And then while she's in Edinburgh in 1822, she's been her expenses are dependent upon him giving her money. She's reliant upon him. She doesn't want to be around him. His friends are harassing her because, of course, she'd like him to be happy and let him go. And you know, she's feeling very pressured, and she's also being sort of pushed into lying under oath. She has to swear an oath of calumny that she has no knowledge of what her husband is doing, which is to set himself up so he gets caught in an act of adultery. I mean, it gets even more tawdry than the initial premise. And she sort of embodies these awful experiences, these awful psychological pressures become embodied for her. She has these stomach complaints. She's very ill. She can't get out. She feels very trapped. And then she's keeping a diary this whole time. When she's well, she's walking all around Edinburgh, you know, enormously long walks. She walks to Roslyn Glen, she's walking through the outskirts, she's exploring out to Queensferry, she's everywhere. And then she just goes off on these 2 amazing solo walking tours. And the transformation in her bodily experience as she goes off on these tours is remarkable. So gone are these mysterious but deeply uncomfortable stomach complaints. And in their place is this a totally different, but probably no less uncomfortable physical discomfort. I mean, she sprains an ankle, which she fixes by rubbing whiskey into it, which I must try next time I twist my ankle. I've always drunk it, which maybe I've been doing the wrong thing with that medicine. And she walks 20, 30 miles a day. And she talks about how tired she is, and she talks about how hard this is. But she talks about it in a completely different register. There's a pleasure in washing the dirt off her feet. There's a triumphalism in recording the amount of miles that she can do in a day and under what circumstances. So I think for someone like Sarah Stoddart Hazlitt, that idea of escape is really important. And it's not even an escape from suffering, it's just an escape from being made to suffer. She then chooses to endure. And that's a completely different psychological state to be in. So that there's definitely an element of escaping from that very constraining, conflicted, you know, horribly false, you know, appallingly morally compromised place into this much more, pure isn't the right word, but certainly simplified physical bodily suffering over which she has total control. I think for some of the other women, it's perhaps less clear cut. I mean, Dorothy Wordsworth, when she's walking, and she walks a lot locally, I think for her, some of those walks are an extension of the domestic economy. She walks a lot to run local errands. So she goes for walks to collect firewood, to collect eggs, to go mushroom hunting, to get the post, to do all these sorts of mundane jobs. So the domestic extends into her walking space. But that's not necessarily, well, in fact, it's not at all a problem. But walking becomes part of that homeliness. And I think for me, that's perhaps the model that's been most useful during lockdown, is how walking becomes part of, but is also still separate from that domestic space. So you're still contributing to the economy of home, but you're also out there enjoying yourself. You're experiencing physical exercise. It is different. So she walks the local area over and over again, laying down layer after layer after layer of memory, you know, people that she's walked with, experiences that she's had. And she manages to find a way of being able to touch all of those memories. Every time she retreads that path, she has access to those prior experiences and can draw them into the present, which is enormously enriching. And that kind of local walking, I'm a guilty Monroeist. I love going up big mountains. And I hadn't really until lockdown put a huge amount of thought into what walking locally repetitively meant. But having now been forced to, that idea of layering the space, bringing it into the home, making it part of your identity, has been enormously important. So for even though I was also trying to escape the four walls and get out, there was something really enriching about extending the home into that space and then bringing that space back into the home. So a slightly more complicated dynamic, I think, for somebody like Dorothy Wordsworth than for Sarah Stoddart Hazlitt, who's just, I just got to get away. So some interesting variances, I think, between the women.
I think that's really true. I think many of us have had the opportunity or been forced to explore our local area, and that layering, as you say, of memory over the same route trodden in both directions time after time after time is fascinating. And one of the things that really comes out, I think, in Dorothy's writing. The other thing that Dorothy was one of the women who didn't make it into Petticoats and Pinnacles, and I was interested in her because she relates a feminine experience, a female experience, that isn't common in writings, particularly of the kind of Trossachs area that they traversed at the time. And I'm kind of sad that she didn't, but it's that thing about space. You referred earlier to Ellen Wheaton, and of course you also include Nan Shepherd, who is also in Petticoats and Pinnacles, and they both talk about their preference of walking alone. And while we've just talked about escape, I was also wondering if there's something about walking alone that's to do with perceived risk of the area that you're walking through, because I think we can't talk about women walking without talking about risk in some way, shape or form, because that's what stops many people walking. And whether there's something there between walking in a town and walking in the country. I live in a moderately sized town, but I have a friend who lives here who won't go walking in the countryside on her own. And I find that hilarious, because to me it's not countryside, because I've lived in much more rural, remote areas, and this is just basic farm tracks. There's nothing off-road even about the walking roundabout here. And I just find that, I was wondering if there's anything that your ladies come up with about risk and how they perceive their space.
Perhaps surprisingly, or maybe surprisingly not, very few of them actually talk explicitly about risk in any way, except to speak of other people's perceptions of the risk that they experience. So I wonder whether the ideas that we've inherited are actually not necessarily based on the realities, but are based on more of a sort of the sort of cultural idea of what it means to be a woman walking. And I'm thinking about Elizabeth Carter, who's walking in the 1730s, 1740s. So right at the beginning of when people were walking for pleasure at all, male or female. Before that, you walked functionally. You were just getting from A to B, you were selling your herring, or you were going to market or whatever. People didn't have the time or the money to just go for fun. So Elizabeth Carter is right at the beginning of this increasing walking tourism. And the only time she doesn't go for a walk that she's interested in is when there are some sailors who pitch up in Deal, and she goes with a companion who she calls an Amazon, who she wants someone who's going to be that physical presence to make sure that they're both safe. But it's only because there are these sailors who've got an appalling reputation. She's grown up in this seaside location. She knows exactly what sailors are. And it's only when they're kicking about that she's got any qualms at all. And the only other time that her safety is referenced is when she's determined to go off out into a blazing winter storm, which is her absolute favourite weather. And she and her family go, "Are you really sure this is sensible?" And rather than have the argument, she acquiesces to their perception of the risk that she would be running. She'd be completely fine. She's completely happy to go out in that, but she doesn't want to have that discussion with her family. So she stays at home and then writes enviously about how amazing the storm sounds and how she wishes she was out in it. So that's a different sense, I think, of risk. And my experience of writing this book, not that I've experienced much sense of fright, except, when I've been walking in the mountains on my own, I will tend to take the difficulty level down a bit, because I'm not the most confident compass reader. I'm great with a map, but if I was to lose my way and need to find a compass bearing, it would get tricky. So I like to just notch the difficulty level down. So I'm not a particularly nervous walker, but even so, reading about Anais Nin walking around the streets of Paris and finding in the physical exposure, in what I would probably perceive as physical vulnerability, extraordinary creative power, being aware of men looking at her sexually, but not finding that predatorial, except in one instance. Otherwise, finding that energizing, drawing and taking the energy from that and turning that into some sort of creativity. I hadn't ever thought about being able to do that. So that was that really challenged my way of thinking about city walking, which is where I would perhaps feel more vulnerable. But she was completely, I can choose to have an encounter or not. She was totally self-possessed about her sexuality, completely confident in herself as a physical woman, in ways that just never occurred to me. And the only other time in the writers that I cover, risk is mentioned is Cheryl Strayed's account, which is the only account of really genuine danger, when she talks about being accosted by two drunks in a very remote location on the Pacific Crest Trail. And there's an account which probably every woman would recognise from a bar or, you know, being out in public, where it starts off as banter and then slides rapidly, but you know, you couldn't put place where it goes on into something really quite horrifying. And she ends up so frightened that she's going to get attacked that she, having walked all day with a massive pack on her back, runs and runs and runs for miles more just to make sure that she gets away. But what I found most disturbing about that account was not, I mean, the encounter with the men is terrifying because it's so recognisable. But what was most disturbing was the sense that if she had been physically sexually assaulted, that it would have overwritten for her all the good that had happened before. It would have become the defining experience of that entire walk. So that's a really tragic thing to think might have happened. But of all the 10 women I've looked at and all the thousands and thousands of miles they must have walked, that's the only encounter that even remotely comes close to being proper risky. So I think our perceptions might not quite accord with the realities of what it is to be out in the hills, which isn't to say that physical harassment in public spaces isn't absolutely real. It totally is. But yeah, I don't know that it operates in quite the ways that we think it does.
I wonder if some of the modern perception of risk is because we have stopped walking as often, as far. It's no longer our primary mode of transport, or for many people, it's not our primary mode of transport. And therefore we view it in quite a different way. It's a different experience for us, particularly if we choose to go walking for pleasure. It's kind of, even although if we're doing domestic walking at the moment, going to the shops, going a bit further to the shop further away to get our exercise at the same time, then normally we would be choosing whether to walk or take the car. Most times, for many people, the car would win. So walking is a separate thing that we do purely for pleasure. Whereas if it's just part of your daily routine, like Dorothy Wordsworth popping to the post office or the equivalent, then it's not quite the same thing, and more people are potentially doing it. It's an interesting thing. And then, of course, in other cultures, it is still very socially unacceptable for a woman to go walking. Never mind a woman to go walking on her own. And I think it's something that is very easy to forget in our culture, that that's the case. My own cousin summed it up quite nicely, saying that she was glad that she was born in this country and at this time to enable her to go into the hills on her own, and that it simply wouldn't have been possible in other places and other times. I think one of the things that surprised me most about your book, just because it had never crossed my mind, was this concept of streetwalkers, of women walking in the city. And I sort of hadn't, although I've done it myself, I sort of hadn't intellectualized it about how enjoyable it is to go walking in the city. And some of Virginia Woolf's comments about kind of losing herself amidst the crowd and being able to watch other people. And you comment that we were streetwalkers and these were our streets to walk. And it reminded me very much of when I was a student. There was a women's group who were having a Reclaim the Streets campaign, that it was okay for women to walk, and they had a kind of walking bus, I suppose we would call it now in school parlance, of people walking home together from a nightclub or from the pub, so that you always had somebody to buddy up with, and it was better to walk than to leap in a taxi because you simply couldn't afford that as students. And I was wondering if there was anything you could say about, our city walkers, because it's so different from my other experience.
Yes, it's not my typical experience either. I've lived in the countryside for a long time, but when I have walked in a city or been in somewhere new, it's been a really helpful way of exploring. So a couple of years ago, I was living in 3 American cities. I got fellowships to libraries to work on a different project whilst I was there. So I was walking around Washington, DC, and then I went to Boston for a few weeks and was there and walking around. And then the next year I went to Los Angeles and made the decision that I didn't want my first driving experience in the US, or indeed my first driving experience on the right-hand side of the road, to be Los Angeles. So I decided not to hire a car, which, if you're going to do that in any city, that's the city where you look most eccentric. And it was fine broadly. What I was quite conscious of, though, was the eccentricity of it being perceived as strange, because I was aware that America is a very car-cultured place, and there I was just wandering off. So I was staying in one of the, near Pasadena, and I just decided to go for a walk the day after I got there. I was jet lagged and wanted some sunshine to try and reset my body clock. And I ended up going for this 10-mile walk, but through some really posh neighborhoods. And there's me not looking my best, you know, tired, just having a mooch around and gawping at everything. So there were birds I'd never seen before. And it just suddenly occurred to me that what would these rich neighbors think of this person who's never been in their neighborhood before, mooching through it? But that was the risk that I thought I was running, not any kind of harassment, just the eccentricity of it, which is something that Ellen Wheaton talks about quite a lot, even when she's on her own in the mountains, is this idea of being singular, of attracting comment. And I think that's perhaps one of the things about Virginia Woolf that's really interesting, is that idea of losing yourself in the crowd, of no longer being singular, because you're surrounded by all sorts of people who are coming, going, walking, cycling, whatever. Everybody's in motion. So the fact that your body is in motion is much, much less obvious, much less noticeable. And there were places where I felt that, and there were places where I felt vulnerable because of that. Washington, DC, I didn't find a particularly friendly city to be walking around. I got catcalled the very first time I set foot out of my door, which wasn't great. Boston, on the other hand, was fantastically accessible, and I was walking and cycling around that very comfortably within a couple of days. So I think if my experience in America, where I've stayed in cities, because I've stayed in cities in the US much more than I have in the UK, was quite varied. And I think that's probably reflective of the women that I've written about and read about, that their experiences of the cities that they inhabited vary considerably, and what it means to be on the streets depends quite a lot on the individual circumstances. So Virginia Woolf at certain times is able to vanish off into the crowd, and at other times it seems that she's there on her own, walking through mental maps on the pavements, and the crowd disappears around her. It's just her and her own internal reality. And depending on what the crowds are doing, what the buses are doing, it seems that she's able to slide in and out of these communal experiences and these much more individuated experiences. And the same sort of thing seems to happen with Anais Nin, where she just sort of drifts in and out of this sort of flaneuse, this disembodied, almost disinterested observer who's above everything, but sometimes becomes very intensely within everything, feels the pulsating life of the city. And that movement between different modes seems to be incredibly powerful. So for me, that's what street walking means. It doesn't mean being stuck in one mode or another, you know, being there as the one that's being looked at, or the one that's being observed, or the one that's doing the observing, but being able to shift between subjectivities at will, or depending on the circumstances, but through choice, seems to be really important to the women I was looking at, and became, as I was more aware of this, to myself as well as a city walker.
Thank you. I was, you're talking about your experiences in the States there, in Los Angeles and Boston, and I suppose this is maybe the most personal question I have today, is that for me, your personal experiences that you included in the book, that kind of bookend it and finish each chapter, made it a much warmer and more pleasant to read book than it was otherwise. And I was wondering if that was obviously it was a conscious decision, but it was a deliberate thing on your part to make it not a dry academic book, because it's absolutely not. It's a very readable and engaging account of these women.
Sort of yes and sort of no. Again, it sort of gestures back to this book's slightly strange origins. It wasn't until I was talking to a friend of mine about the book that I had started to think I was writing, and he said to me, well, you do know you're a walking woman too, don't you? And oh okay. And this had never occurred to me that I was writing about something that I was also participating in. I mean, I never wanted this book. Once I realised what it was I was actually writing, I never wanted it to be a dry academic book locked away in an expensive monograph that research libraries, and that's about it, and my mother would read, and not even my mother, unless paid. I definitely wanted it to find a wider readership than that, but that wasn't the motivation for including my own experiences. That was more because someone pointed out to me that what I was doing was making myself part of a larger movement, and that I should perhaps reflect that or do something with that notion, which it had never occurred to me to do until that moment. So what I had been doing was keeping a diary of my walks, because I was trying to reflect on what these women were doing, not for inclusion, just to have a sense of what it was they were up to. And that started to form the basis of some of the walks that made it in there, was those sorts of experiences. So as with pretty much everything to do with how this book came about, it was a muddled sequence of happenstance, nice conversations with cleverer people than I am, and then random stuff that I had just on the off chance started to do, which then became more and more central as I realised that, like Rebecca Solnit in Wanderlust, one of the things that makes that book sing is the fact that she is also a walker participating in this culture that she's critiquing. And I do not have any aspirations to be as amazing a writer as Solnit, but that kind of sense of I too participate in this was certainly something that grew as the book progressed.
I really enjoyed you placing yourself in that tradition, and it makes it feel like any of us could, which I think is a wonderful place to be. I'm kind of very aware of the time, and I was wondering if maybe we should open up for questions if we're feeling brave.
Thank you both for such a engaging in conversation event. It's been a great way to start the Women's History Month series of events at the library, and we're going to open up. We've got a number of questions out there from the, let me have a quick look, over 300 people who are in attendance tonight. So we didn't want to tell you that was the volume, but I'm now joined by our colleague Jo Stevenson. Jo, I think you might have the first question.
Yep, I do. Thank you very much, both from me as well. It was really, really fascinating, and I could listen to you guys chatting all day, to be perfectly honest. So what are some of the rituals that you've found, or common themes and commonalities amongst these women who have a passion for walking?
That's a really interesting question, and I'm pausing because I'm not sure I did find a huge amount of consistency between them. I guess the only thing I can think of is that walking really mattered. It wasn't something trivial that they just did. It really, really mattered. And when they didn't have the opportunity, that mattered. But in terms of rituals, they all had quite different attitudes to walking. So someone like Dorothy Wordsworth seems to have been completely unself-conscious about being a walker. She goes and runs her errands, she walks where she's walking. That's fine, she writes about it. So there's no self-consciousness about that. Whereas someone like Ellen Wheaton goes to quite considerable lengths to obscure the fact that she is out on her own. She loves walking on her own, but she doesn't want other people to know about it. So she has a lot of other rituals that she goes through to sort of disguise that, staying in certain accommodation, making sure that she's read her guidebook so she doesn't need to rely on a mountain guide, which was how a lot of people got up big things in the 18th and 19th centuries. She doesn't do that. She's self-propelled all the time so that she doesn't attract anybody's notice. And even Virginia Woolf and Aeneas Nin, who are writing at around about the same sorts of times, about the same sorts of environments, Virginia Woolf is not thinking about herself sexually at all, as far as I can tell. What she does is explore the mental landscape that walking enables her to access. Whereas Anais Nin is much more about the sensory impressions, much more about the externalities than Woolf is. So I think there's a huge amount of divergence in the experiences and the ways in which these women approach the very different kinds of walking that they go through. Some of them are very experienced. You know, Nan Shepherd is a very accomplished mountaineer. Cheryl Strayed, when she sets out, is clueless. She doesn't even know how to pack a bag properly. So there's a huge amount of difference in experience there. And I think for me, that's part of what makes this so rich, this whole history, not just my book, the whole history of women's walking, is that there's so much difference in how women value it, how women approach it, what they take from it, that there should be something for everybody there. You don't have to be a conquering monk to find in these accounts something of value to you, whether you're walking on a riverside or you're just walking around the pavements where you live. There are resonances throughout this very diverse material, I think.
Thank you. You have anything you want to add from your research, Paula, on that?
No, I mean, I suppose the only ritual that they all have in common is that they wrote about it. And obviously the history is constructed around the women who've written about it. And we know there are dozens, hundreds, thousands of women who have gone and done many things that we don't know about simply because they haven't written it. And it feels a little bit unfair. And I think it's always important that we kind of remember that we're only seeing this small section. In Kerry's case, it's kind of okay in that she deals particularly in literature, so it makes sense. But for the Petticoats and Pinnacles side, I'm always very aware that there are lots of people who will have done things that we don't know about.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. Kenny.
Thanks, Jill. Question to you both, really, from Debbie Harley. Debbie, thanks for joining us this evening. Do you walk solo or with others, or a combination of the two? Kerry first, and then
mostly with others, though sometimes solo, but with different effects depending on who I'm walking with, and also different effects if I'm walking on my own as well. So at the moment, it's because we're limited to households. I do a lot of my walking with my husband, or at least I did until I became too pregnant to really be able to walk very far at all, in which case it's mostly just comedy, a little waddle here and there. But before I was pregnant with my second child, my husband and I would go off with our son. And that's a very different dynamic to before I had children, when I was off in the mountains, which was often to start with a walking group. So a larger group of 10, 12, 15 people, different abilities. And then when I became more confident, much smaller groups, perhaps one or two friends who I'd met, and we would go off and do quite big stuff together. And then as my confidence increased further, I did some solo walking. I've climbed more than a couple of Munros on my own. And the difference in conversation I've had with people that I've met when I've been on my own have been quite marked. And if I'm walking with female friends compared to male friends, that also affects the sorts of encounters and the sorts of experiences I've had as well. So it's been really interesting to observe that and to notice it much more as I've been writing this book, because I was oblivious to quite a lot of this. Has been really interesting. So I was walking Ben Cruachan a few summers ago on my own. I ended up on my own. My husband and my sister-in-law back, and I got to the mountaintop on my own quite late in the afternoon, and there was another family up there, and they said, would you like to walk with us? And I got quite panicky about how high up I was and how far back I'd got to go on my own. And I don't know if they'd have done that, if they'd have made that offer to a group of walkers or even to a male walker. But that moment was really important, and I ended up needing their help because I didn't realise it, but I was about to get heat stroke. I'd start suffering from heat exhaustion. And they needed my help because they hadn't got a clue which way they were going and nearly took themselves off up onto this really dangerous high ground. So it was this really interesting dynamic between us that I think was only possible because I was a solitary woman walker. And that compared to some really different experiences when I've been with male companions. So I don't know how that compares with what you've found, Paula, on your walking.
I think absolutely. I'd echo that. I've kind of done both. I lived in a rural area for a long time, so I became quite used to walking in the countryside on my own. Never did high hill walking completely solo. Did medium high hill walking, I suppose, on my own, but there was always just that sense of if it all went wrong and nobody knew I was there and there was nobody at home to know that I wasn't coming back. So it would have been the note on the tire on the car and hoping that somebody noticed that the car was still there the next morning, kind of thing, if something had happened. So I've always had that kind of awareness of being remote, I suppose. But I would be quite happy to walk on my own in less remote areas. But you're right, it's that thing about the conversation, and you can find it even walking in cities, or if you go to, I don't know, a work conference. If you go in a group and stay in the group, you only ever talk to the group. Whereas if you go to something like that on your own, where you know nobody, then people will talk to you, and it's quite, and you get a whole different dynamic. So I think it's quite interesting, and I think people should try going on their own somewhere they feel comfortable, obviously. But yeah.
Lovely, thanks very much. Jo, over to you for the next question.
Yeah, thank you. So the next question is from Frances, and she said, does the book reference disabled walkers at all? As a type 1 diabetic, I completed the Munros and write regularly on walking, which is actually the website I write for monthly. Sounds really interesting. Thanks, Frances.
It's a fantastic question, and no, I don't. But I've been, since working on this book, I've been much more aware of people with disabilities and what walking means for them. I've got a friend called Polly Atkin who writes really interestingly about what it is to walk with disabilities. And there was an event at the Poetry Library, I think I'm losing track of time because it all blurred together for the last 12 months. But an event called Unwalking, which was talking about what it means to walk with differently abled bodies, with trans bodies, with bodies that mean that walking 200 meters is an extraordinary experience. And that was illuminating. So I am not doing that kind of really necessary and important work, but I know of lots and lots of people who are doing work on that sort of thing. And one of the things I think Polly's work is really important about is challenging the narrative that somehow by walking we can cure everything, that it is some sort of magical health giver. Polly and I share a permanent genetic condition. We've both got hemochromatosis, and there is no amount of walking in the universe that is going to undo the genetics that mean that we load iron. And there are many, many, many other conditions that are not budgeable through those sorts of mechanisms. Yeah. So I think one of the things that I perhaps would like to do if I did another book is to think more about how differently abled bodies operate in the landscape, how those ideas intersect in a way that I've seen other people do that's really sensitive to the idea that extraordinary experiences are possible and, importantly, are being documented, that may or may not look like these standard narratives of going up something massive, conquering it, claiming victory over it, that there are many, many different ways of accessing the sorts of important, creative, necessary, escapist, essential experiences that walking enables without slipping into this sort of dialogue of walking as cure. So I'm sorry to say I don't do that, but there is an increasing body of really important work out there that is doing that sort of thing.
Yeah, sounds fascinating. Do you have anything to add on that, Paula? Or
just to say that we have a brand new internship at the library with through the Scottish Graduate School of Arts and Humanities, and Miriam just started today, so this is brand shiny new, and we're going to, one of the things that we're looking at is finding people who are challenging those kind of social conventions, which would include walking with disabilities, to mirror the women that are appearing in the Petticoats and Pinnacles exhibition. So we're hoping to include some elements of that in our forthcoming information on, probably on the Aiming High learning zone.
Watch this space.
Yep.
Thanks, Kenny.
Yeah, the next question again is for both of you, and it comes from Rose George. Rose says, hello, I'm a fell runner. Did either of you come across any women throughout history who ran in the hills, mountains, fells? And she goes on and says, I love to picture the Bronte sisters picking up their skirts and pelting down a hillside but I've never found any evidence of it. Keep looking, Rose. That's all I can say, because I'm sure we would all like that image. But what about you two? Have you come across anything like that?
I haven't come across anything of people running or women running.
For me, I'm terrified of fell runners, partly because I'm so envious of their fitness, and also because they seem to run down things that I am very, very timid about. They're extraordinary human beings, but also really annoying. I've been up here all day, I've got half the distance you have. It's really frustrating, but extraordinary to see, and a wonderful part of what goes on in the hills. I haven't come across any accounts of running, but I do know there's a woman called Rachel Hewitt, again, one of the directors of the Women in the Hills project, who is working on a book that's all about women's experiences outdoors through history, called In Her Nature, and that should be out in the next couple of years. And one of the things that she's interested in as a fell runner herself is the history of mountaineering, the history of fell running, these sports that are going on. So that may well be something that sort of history may well be being filled in fairly soon, you know, with the research that she's been doing. She's been finding some extraordinary material about women up the mountains far earlier than I realised they were, doing all sorts of things that I didn't realise women were doing or could do. So I think her research will be, if that's something you're particularly interested in, I think that would be something that's well worth keeping an eye out.
Great, thanks, Kerry. So always keep an eye out for that book. Joe, over to you for the next question. Just to say that we've got quite a number of questions still waiting to be asked. So I hope, Paul and Kerry, you're not desperate for your tea or anything, because we'll try and get through as many as we can. Joe, over to you.
Yes, I think we both suspected that might happen, so that's lovely. I've got a quick question for you, Paula, first, and then I'll ask a supplementary question if that's okay. So the first one is from Helen, and she's saying, could you repeat the name of the lady who studied in the Dolomites?
Maria Ogilvie Gordon.
Maria Ogilvie Gordon. Okay, so hopefully, Helen, you've got that. We are recording this, so you'll be able to catch up as well if you have had to shoot off. And my proper question, if you like, is from Andrew Green, and he has said, this is brilliant, thank you both, especially for me. I'm writing a history of walking in Wales, and women walkers are of great interest. 2 questions. Do you treat any working class women walkers in the book and also in the exhibition? And secondly, have you noticed an efflorescence, now that's not the easiest word to say under pressure, of solo long distance women walkers in the last 10 years? So working class women and long distance women walkers.
Paula, do you want to go first with yours?
Yeah, sure. No, we don't cover anybody truly working class. It's to do with that thing about it being people who have written about their experiences. So, and in my case, we cut off in kind of the 1950s. So it's an area that we know we haven't covered, but we were limited by the material that's available. So we're trying to cover it elsewhere. And I think I don't know if there's a genuine burgeoning of the amount of outdoor activities in general that women are doing. I think perhaps there is, that it's becoming socially acceptable for people to do it. So you feel a bit less odd going out and doing stuff, but also that we're just more aware of it. We're having these conversations that we didn't have 10 years ago. And the women just simply weren't credited with the things that they were doing, which is why work like Kerry's is so important, to make sure that these hidden histories are brought forth and included into a wider history. So it's not a man's history and a woman's history. It's all brought together into a true history, which would be a much better place to be. So I think, yeah, there is a bit of a efflorescence.
For me, in my book, there is a working class writer. Ellen Wheaton was a governess and born in a not especially fantastic part of West Lancashire, and married a labourer, an abusive labourer, and didn't ever enjoy any particular material wealth, but was walking nonetheless. And you know, Paul is absolutely right that one of the things that shapes both, well, pretty much everything to do with the histories that we're dealing with, is who access, who has time, who has the material resources to be able to write and document and otherwise explore their experiences. So that does shift things. And I think with Paula's last point about this idea of true history moving beyond gender, that one of the things that I found is class is actually perhaps as important as gender.
Absolutely.
In shaping who has access to these stories. That one of the reasons why Elizabeth Carter in the early 18th century was able to get off and walk is, I mean, she's not particularly well born, she's the daughter of a local curate, but through her writing, she earns enough money to be materially independent. She's not reliant on a man, she doesn't have to marry, she doesn't have to work. She has the ability to write and walk for pleasure. So it's that access to material resources that makes a huge difference. So I don't think anybody I cover would be upper class, because upper class women have their own pressures about what it is that they were able to do, the sorts of walking it was possible for them to do, that in some ways was as restrictive. So, I'm thinking of Dorothy Wordsworth, not brilliantly wealthy, certainly not wealthy at all when she was starting out in Grasmere with her brother, and in terms of independent wealth, almost nothing. But would we count her as working class? So even there, perhaps class isn't the right determinant so much as access to independent material resources. That seems to me to be a really important factor. But I would echo what was said. I think we've become increasingly aware of women as walkers, as people in the outdoors, and that it's something that we should be paying attention to. But even so, the bestsellers, because I've been vaingloriously keeping an eye on the Amazon bestsellers list for mountaineering literature, and just before Christmas, when the book was selling particularly well, I was very, very proud to be in the top 5, but I was the only woman, and the only other woman anywhere near is Nan Shepherd. And it's not because I'm the only one writing about walking. There are lots and lots of really interesting stories being told by women about the outdoors, but still it's a very male-dominated bestsellers list. And I think we need to challenge that as well, that whilst women are absolutely walking in huge numbers, that we need to do more to recognise the value of their stories, and to buy their stories, and to bring those back into conversation with what we've assumed is the universal experience, but which we're actually learning is increasingly very much the male experience, and that is not the same thing whatsoever.
Thank you very much.
Kerry, I've got to ask this question that's come from Perty. Perty asks, I was wondering what sort of book you thought you were writing to begin with. I
thought I was writing a book about the history of movement, but what I had been struck by, at that point I was doing a lot of walking in the Lake District, was how differently we were moving through the landscape, with cars going around the circumference of the Lake District to get into the different valleys, in contrast to what was happening in the 18th and 19th centuries, which is you just walk over the mountain pass and down into the next valley, and that would be that. So I was interested in things like drove roads, coffin routes, those sorts of things, and finding out about how they operated and what people's experiences of those were. And in the notebook for that, on the first page, find out more about women's accounts, brackets, if they exist. So this was very much, the women's accounts was a subset of, well, if you can find some, that might be an interesting part to include in this completely different book. As I say, it wasn't until someone said, I don't think that's the book you're writing, dear, that okay, I'm actually writing about women walkers. Oh, okay, right, that's great. It was to be this totally different thing. And I'm glad I got nudged helpfully early on into a much more interesting path.
I'm sure we're all delighted that the book you've finished with is the one that we've got, and maybe that other book will come out at another time. Joe, we've still got another 5 minutes or so for questions, so the next one to you.
Thank you. So this question is from Ling, and they've asked, the film Eddie, I'm not sure if it's Eddie or Edie, yeah, it looks like you know the one I'm talking about, is interesting on many levels, but in this context is about an older woman, 84, who was prevented from climbing by a demanding husband, but decided to do so once he died. Did you find evidence of ageism when doing your research?
In my case, quite a few of the women actually went travelling later in life.
So once they had either their children were grown up enough that they could go off and leave them, or that their social and familial restrictions were removed usually by the death of a father. In some cases, they had been looking after their parents. So once their parents died, they were then free to go. I think, though, in that age thing, there's also a thing probably about menstruation and about how much easier it was not to have to bother with that if you were traveling on horseback through the Himalayas, for example, in the case of Jane Duncan, at the kind of age that she went. So in their 50s and 60s, maybe, rather than much later. There are some accounts of older women going, and there's a lovely statement in the Ladies Scottish Climbing Club book about how it's a good club to grow old in, where you can use where you need friends to help you, because you need two hands to hold on and another two to bend your knees. Which is a lovely thing. So there are some accounts, but not. It's still relatively unusual, I think, for women of great age, if 84 is great age, to go and do that.
In my experience, what I found was a little bit different to what Paula found, and what was happening was that women were just getting older, so that their bodies weren't working as well. So Elizabeth Carter was walking very regularly all the way until old age hit, and then her walks got smaller and smaller, shorter and shorter, and eventually she wasn't able to walk at all. And the same thing happened to Harriet Martyr, though, that it was actually health. There wasn't any ageist attitudes, it was just what her body was or was not capable of. So she had a heart condition that gradually made it impossible for her to walk. And someone like Nan Shepherd, who was out walking and in the mountains for quite a long while, but eventually gets slowed down by age as well. So I've not come across any ageism, just the physical effects of aging bodies starting to limit what women could do. So not quite the same thing, I think, as Paula found.
Yeah, I think I could maybe join that club already, where you need somebody else to help you bend your knees. I'm only in my 30s, that's not good.
So you were going to carry my baby bump for me, that would be really useful.
Yeah, I've got my own, thank you. Kenny, over to you.
Thanks. We've got a question from Jess, and Jess says, thank you for a lovely talk. Did you find differences in language women used about walking to make it seem more acceptable in the past versus now? For example, more passive language than adventure language?
No, not necessarily. What I found was that women noticed different things, that it wasn't the language of dominance, it wasn't the language of conquering, it's not about being the most powerful, it's not about competition, it's not those sorts of tropes that we would perhaps recognise from mountain literature written by men. What it was about was companionship for a lot of women. I'm thinking of Dorothy Wordsworth's account of climbing Scafell Pike in 1818, which is one of the first accounts of anybody walking up that mountain. And she did it with a lot of servants, which was a very sensible thing, who carried the picnic, which is something I think we should perhaps bring back, is having people to carry your picnic as well as bend your knees. But what she does when she gets to the top is not celebrate, because they kind of climb it by accident. They don't realise that Scafell Pike is the highest peak. They think that's Scafell. They go up this one because they can reach it. And when she gets there, she looks over and she sees the big mountains. But what she thinks about is this storm that comes past and then carries on and hits Skiddaw, which is where her friends are walking. And her mind turns to them and what this storm means for them. And then her gaze turns downwards and she starts to notice the very intricate, minute life that's living on the boulders. If you've ever been to the top of Scafell Pike, it's this blasted, primordial landscape where nothing seems to be alive. But she's able to see all this wonderful, colourful life down on these rocks. And I was talking to Jo Taylor, who recreated this walk 2 years ago in costume. And one of the points that she made was that wearing a bonnet, which you would have sat over your face like that, meant it was more difficult for women to stand and see the big vistas. But it certainly made it easier to talk to people individually and to look down on the ground and to notice those sorts of views. So it wasn't so much that it was that there's any concern about acceptability, I think there are some practical effects of what women were able to wear, and also perhaps just a different emphasis. I mean, Nan Shepherd is perfectly capable of going up the biggest mountains in Britain, but talks about that as part of a developmental phase as a mountaineer, and that it's all about actually becoming one with the mountain, that the peak is irrelevant. It's about a totally different relationship, which is in contrast, I think, to a lot of the literature that we have read and inherited. So yeah, not so much a difference in language, so much as a difference in approach, I found. I don't know what Paula's experiences were.
Yeah, I think that's probably fair. I think for some of my lady travellers, so Isabella Bird and Jane Duncan in the Himalayas, who both had what sound as if they must have been fairly terrifying experiences crossing gorges on rope kind of pulleyed bridges, or just tiny little hill tracks on a donkey with a parasol and eating a scone, is kind of the risks of those things are played down. So the scone incident was Jane's, and she decided that she might as well just carry on riding like that, even although her donkey was skidding left, right and centre, and if she had fallen it was hundreds of feet into the ravine, because if she went, she went. But she kind of played it down. There was no, oh, I've done this heroic thing. It was all, oh, well, you know, it happened and we got through it and I ate my scone and it was all fine. And I think part of that is being very aware of the social censure at home with the people who are reading the books. That it's not the done thing for women to be heroic. Heroes are men. And so they kind of played that down. So it's not so much the language as the way they present the incidents that happen as maybe matter of fact, or they just go on with it, or it'd be fine.
Great, thanks both. We've got time for a couple more questions. So Jo, over to you for the penultimate question.
Yeah, thank you very much. This question comes from Charlotte, and she says, I have a friend who's active in a women's group called the Walkie Talkies, which I think is fantastic. The goal is conversation as much as walking and exercise. Do you think walking is conducive, in particular, to meaningful conversation for women especially?
Paula, would you take this? I'm going to have to move into a new room. My toddler.
Yes, of course.
So I will duck and answer in just a moment.
Okie doke. I think there's something.
Wonderful world of live Zoom when something like this happens. There's 200 odd people going, this is brilliant.
I love that. There's something about walking with somebody outside of your enclosed environment that means that you can have, I think, freer discussions than you would if there were four walls to hear you. And I don't know if it's a peculiarly female thing, in all honesty, but I know that there's something too about walking side on to somebody rather than confrontationally face to face with them that enables you to have conversations that you might not have otherwise. And I think the same is true actually about sitting in a car, for example. I've had some really good conversations with my teenage son sitting side by side, where it's just easier to have those conversations. I think if you're in a rhythm and you're outside and there's something about having the ability to go, oh, look, there's a squirrel at awkward moments, makes it easier to have what could be either difficult conversations or just revealing personal, emotional conversations. So yeah, I think there is something in it.
For me, and thank you for bearing with me, the toddler was being very charming, but he was also being quite loud. Bless him. I didn't think it was quite his time for his Zoom debut. That one of the things that I found really interesting about walking is that, especially in a group, is how conversations organically arise, and then the group reconfigures. You stop for a drink, or you stop for a picnic break, and then you've got a completely different group dynamic, and then a different conversation starts, or you'll perhaps pick up a thread that you had earlier with a different person, and that walking alongside enables this really interestingly organic flow of conversation that I don't recall having in other circumstances. So that for me is one of the most interesting things, is just how these topics emerge, and as Paul says, sometimes from happenstance. And then you drift into these companionable silences, which seem more possible when you're walking. They might be awkward in a, you know, if you were face to face, but you're still both just walking, you're still both together. You're just not necessarily, you know, just in conversation. So yeah, it's an interesting dynamic when you're on foot with conversation, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's highly relatable. I'm sure everybody will have had experiences like that where you realize, you know, you've been chatting for hours to somebody and talking about, you know, far more personal things, and as you say, than you might normally, Paula. So yeah, really interesting. Kenny, over to you.
Yeah, we've got time for one last question. Kerry, you did magnificently there. That was brilliant. Final question comes from Geraldine Murphy. Geraldine asks, what does walking mean to you and how does it affect you? First.
That's a massive question, a really great question. For me, I'd say it means it does mean different things and has meant different things at different points in my life. So when I first moved to Scotland, being able to walk in the mountains was this massive adventure. I'd never seen mountains before like they were in Scotland. And it was part of falling in love with the country I'd just moved to. And as my body got stronger, it was also part of a changing relationship with my body, which has always been unruly in terms of its size and its shape and its physical capacity. And all of a sudden, well, not all of a sudden, through quite a lot of very hard work, I was able to do really, really big walks that I had only ever dreamed of. And that was really powerful. As I've been pregnant the first time and the second time, I found walking really hard. You know, I get a lot of pelvic symphysis pain, so a lot of joint discomfort. I get a lot of backache. Walking is physically uncomfortable and has been for quite a long time over the course of this pregnancy. So it's one of the things that I'm really looking forward to having back is the ability to walk longer distances, and partly, you know, it's also made lockdown strangely more bearable because I haven't been able to get into the mountains anyway. And whether it was lockdown or my body, I wouldn't be there. So it's, for me, it's a shifting relationship that it seems to ebb and flow as my life stages move forwards. But I very much hope to capture some of that mountain love and you know, once I've stopped bearing children, to be able to get back into doing the really big climbs, and then eventually to explore those with my children, and which I'm sure will bring a totally new dimension to that relationship with the mountains and the relationship with my body and the relationship with walking, which all for me come together in this really complicated way, that there'll be another layer to add, which I'm really looking forward to. So it's a big muddle, but that's a fantastic question. So thank you very much. I'm not sure, it'd be interesting to hear what Paul has to say about that.
I think it's such a difficult thing to put into to clarify and to make sense. And in fact, I know I'm not doing that right now, because it's something you do all the time. So I walk to work when we're in work, and I often have to cross between library buildings. And one of the things that I used to always find was that I always ended up kind of trotting between them. I never left quite enough time, and but I really enjoyed having that kind of 20 minutes to put the meeting you'd been at in context or to prepare for the one that was coming. So I think there's something about mental clarity around walking and the rhythm of walking that enables you to clear out what's there, have a think about it, and move on to the next thing. And I've kind of missed that working at home, that now that we're doing Teams meetings left, right and centre, it's very easy to swap from one meeting to the next, but actually your head doesn't swap as quickly, and I don't feel like I'm functioning as well because of that. So I think there's a clarity thing. I think there's something about I do quite a lot of bird watching. I enjoy being out in nature, and one of the things I've enjoyed about walking during lockdown is getting to know my local area. We found paths I didn't know before. We found things, there's a badger set within a few hundred yards of our house that we didn't know was there, and it's been quite exciting to get to know the local area in those kind of depths, I suppose, which is good. And then walking also has is the Dorothy Wordsworth memory thing, that I grew up in a small town, large village. There was nothing there, too young to go to the pub. So my first dates were walking. And I have these lovely memories of walking in the area that I grew up in with lovely young gentleman who I was out with at the time, and it has kind of changed how I view those places because there's those memories to go with them. So I think walking can mean many different things, as Kerry said, at different stages of your life.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. What a lovely way to end a lovely webinar. So thank you both so much for such an engaging and interesting evening. I'm sure the 500 people who booked tonight will or have really enjoyed this evening from all over the world. And I'm sure they'll be looking to buy the book, Kerry. Just in case you missed the title, it's called Wanderers, A History of Women Walking.